Now, I'm recording this after Dave Chappelle's Netflix special, The Closer. So let's talk about Dave Chappelle, who's an odd case. First, he's so famous he can get stuff on Netflix nobody else could. Netflix can live with the backlash because they know he'll give them the numbers. Love it, hate it, or use it to retrench your positions in the culture war, a Chappelle special is an event. He's uniquely positioned to draw people into conversations they wouldn't usually have, if he wanted to. But instead of changing the conversation, there's a pretty clear consensus in the trans community that he's doing harm to get a laugh here, that he hasn't made the kind of effort that'd earn him standing to talk this way, that what he's saying hurts people. Part of me wanted to go easy on Chappelle because he came up in the 90s when the lines were in very different places, and he took a 10-year break, an eternity in comedy. He chose not to keep up, so could it be that he's just reading the room badly? Perhaps he's just biased because some of the people hit by, scare quotes, cancel culture are personal friends of his. He's on record now defending Louis C.K. and Kevin Hart, or heroes of his like Bill Cosby. Could his affection for those guys be clouding his judgment? One comment on Jezebel thought he's simply lost his edge, so he's going back to the same spots that made him successful in the early O's, when it was okay to make homophobic and transphobic jokes. Chappelle's doing old jokes, but with the new trick of framing himself as the anti-cancel culture martyr hero in order to remain relevant, even as he stays in his mean jokes comfort zone. I don't think any of these excuses give him enough credit. Dave Chappelle is way too smart to be this far off base because he's misreading the room, biased towards his friends, or just too lazy to update his jokes. Look at the contents of his Netflix specials. Trans folk, sexual harassment allegations against Louis C.K., Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby's legacy, and let's not forget Age of Spin, the special whose final line was a rape joke, following a 30-minute build-up. Chappelle is aiming for the pressure points like a smart bomb. He knows exactly what he's doing, and that's why he's doing it. But why? Well, some guesses. One, as a sheer flex. I'm such a good stand-up, I'll even get you to laugh at this shit. Two, to try to position himself in the dead center of the culture wars. Every special has things that conservatives could agree with and things they'd criticize. Some things liberals would appreciate and others they would hate. By positioning himself in that spot, Chappelle stirs up some very hard conversations, but also puts himself at the center of attention. Maybe he doesn't care what we're talking about and whether we're pleased or offended, as long as we're also talking about him. Chappelle has calibrated these specials in exactly the spot where half of America is mad at Netflix for airing his special, but Netflix is still willing to air his next one. There should be a name for doing something that people say they hate, yet they demand more of it. Let's call it pulling a Facebook. Chappelle's pulled a Facebook 6 times in a row with his Netflix specials. And here we are, wringing our hands again, like Dory from Finding Nemo, forgetting what happened before. 3. I think Dave Chappelle sees himself in the role of comedian as truth-teller. He tackles fraught issues and tries to avoid the cliches and talking points of either the left or the right. More than any specific comment he's made, I think this is the statement he's trying to make by doing this at all. That we've fallen into so many patterns and talking points, we've retreated so deep into our camps, that real conversations about some vital issues have become nearly impossible to have. By storytelling and focusing on individual people he's met, Chappelle avoids the talking points. And if you talked to him, I think he'd tell you he wasn't on the left or the right, that he's on the side of people. His call for empathy at the end of The Closer reveals this desire to be this guy, and his comedy is full of stories about people he met who said something to him or who helped him see things in a different way. And he's right that empathy and personal encounters can have transformative power. But I think in taking on trans rights, Chappelle's reached the limits of what you can accomplish if your main source of input about the world and society is conversations with individuals. Some things only make sense connected to a bigger context, and the farther a person goes outside of their personal experience, the more this is true. On Daphne Dorman, it's great that Chappelle had a meaningful connection with a trans woman. Some people might appreciate how he tells her story in a way that humanizes her and treats her with as much dignity as a stand-up comedian ever treats anyone. But if Dave Chappelle really cares about trans folk, how could he miss the amount of hatred and bullying the TERF movement has channeled toward trans folk, or the types of allies they've worked with? The tiniest sliver of attention would be enough for him to notice that. Following a single trans person or LGBTQ publication on Twitter, or reading 5 online articles a month about LGBTQ issues would be enough to see that being a TERF is not a safe middle ground in the trans rights culture war. And Chappelle isn't even paying that much attention. Can't be bothered, I guess. Another one. When he starts comparing the accomplishments of LGBTQ advocacy with the modern civil rights movement, I winced. There are so many ways to learn about intersectionality, and Chappelle missed them all. 20 minutes on YouTube would do it. One conversation would have been enough to learn that when oppressed groups pick fights with each other, the only winner is the oppressor, because it's the same power structures holding every oppressed group down. But Chappelle missed that. It takes 30 seconds to explain intersectionality. Here, look. Listen, Dave. Oppression hits different people in different ways. Race, gender, sexuality, poverty, disability, education, neurology, and some people in more than one way. But the system that oppresses people like you is the same system that oppresses people different from you. When oppressed people fight each other instead of joining to fight oppression, the only real winner is the oppressors. And the best way to fight oppression is to recognize that we all have more to gain by working together. There. Chappelle couldn't take 30 seconds to learn that? His nuanced take on race issues makes it clear he has the intelligence to get it, so the only reason he doesn't must be because he's uninterested. The list goes on. He spends enough attention on LGBTQ folk to write jokes about them, but never bothered to absorb the fact gender is more complex than the body parts you have or the ones you're born with. Chappelle likes talking about people he meets, but again and again he has shown himself to be incurious about the bigger social forces behind the individuals he meets. And incuriosity is the worst possible trait for a fella who fancies himself to be a brave truth-teller. Dave Chappelle is absolutely brilliant when talking about race. As a black man, he's seen the pain racism has inflicted on his community. He's had enough conversations about it, seen enough to intuit the structural stuff, even if he hasn't read the literature on it. But as a non-gay, non-trans, non-woman, he has not lived his life pickled in that type of oppression, and can't count on intuiting how oppression works on other communities. The gaps in what he knows, even after almost a decade of opportunities to get in the loop since his 2013 comeback, show that he's mostly uninterested in learning anything you can't pick up from a series of one-on-ones with interesting people. Chappelle clearly has an aversion to talking points and catchphrases. He does a whole thing hating on the phrase punching down. But the idea of punching down comes out of the importance that comedians know where the power lies, how oppression works, and how jokes land differently depending on how much relative power a group has in society. Dave Chappelle seems determined to get cancelled to make some kind of point. He's already in his Christ on the cross martyr pose in case he does. If comedians are to be our audacious prophets, it's inexcusable that he's misread where the power lies so badly. How does he think punching up means diminishing Me Too and trans rights? How did he miss that the people complaining about cancel culture are doing it on humongous platforms like Fox News and the New York Times editorial page? How did he fail to notice the hypocrisy of the cancel culture complainers who turn around and use the same canceling techniques on James Gunn, Dan Harmon, Kathy Lee, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Colin Kaepernick, and hundreds of not rich, not famous educators trying to teach a racial history of America that's based in facts? If he's arguing against cancel culture, it would be nice if he were clear that it doesn't only affect super rich comedians and Harvey Weinstein. And wouldn't it be great if he could take some of his sympathy for Kevin Hart and apply it instead to the single mom who lost her job waiting tables because she wore a rainbow pin, or the teacher catching heat for bringing the 1619 Project into her high school class instead of the I Have a Dream speech? Near the end of the special, Chappelle talks about Daphne Dorman in a gross, "a trans person said nice things about me" bit that includes him quoting her that he doesn't punch down, he punches lines. I think Dave is trying to say that comedians are not just there to play out society's power dynamics or to challenge them. They're there to tell jokes. Yet he spends so much of his special talking about power and who's got it in different ways. He puts those words in the mouth of his dead trans friend in order to put the point above reproach. I think Chappelle wants to reject the whole punching down conversation rather than play a part in it. But it is impossible for the most successful stand-up comedian working today to not be a part of the conversation about where power lies in society, in stand-up comedy, and in conversations about trans folk and feminism, if he chooses to talk about them in his special. Hiding behind the "I'm just being provocative" shield, or the "my dead trans friend said it" shield, is just cowardly when he is the one with the platform. The closer ended with three things that really pushed against each other. Chappelle says when the daughter of his trans friend who died of suicide comes of age, and he gives her the trust fund he set up, he'll say,
"Young lady, I knew your father. And he was a wonderful woman."
Misgendering her for a laugh, trying to make the point that misgendering someone is not as important as recognizing their humanity. Then he says, "I don't punch down because I don't look down on anyone," and asks everybody to have empathy. And then he asks for a truce between him and the trans and LGBTQ community, but also asks if they would stop punching down on black people. This is the way with 2020's Dave. He ends in really interesting places. He's clearly aiming for a place that he considers very nuanced, but he gets there by clawing at sensitive spots, hoping that if everyone's bleeding a little, we can finally talk about things. The message he has isn't as edgy as he thinks it is. It hurts people who already get hurt a lot. And those gaps in his knowledge when he's talking about people different than himself, they just undermine his message of empathy completely. I think a lot of good conversations about women's rights and trans rights might be started because of this special, but it will be in spite of Chappelle, not because of him. And they'll start off on the wrong foot if someone is coming in hot with all Chappelle's talking points in hand. Dave Chappelle is in a win-win situation now, because either he gets cancelled and he gets to start planning his cancelled world tour where he throws red meat to everyone who's still nostalgic for Milo Yiannopoulos, or he doesn't, and he gets another $20 million for a Netflix special titled Too Big to Cancel. Dave wins no matter what. Who loses? The trans community, especially the ones still online, and the LGBTQ comedians and activists whose harassers and abusers have just been given a massive Chappelle-sized license to dial up the constant hum of abuse they already experience. Everybody who has to do the emotional labor of explaining yet again to people they know that being a TERF is not a safe middle ground between supporting and opposing trans rights, even though Dave Chappelle made it sound that way. For all his talk about how they're going to cancel him, Dave has not been cancelled as far as I can tell. But if he isn't even paying enough attention to what's actually going on in society to notice that TERFs hurt trans people, I am no longer confident he's perceptive enough to notice that he has accidentally proven the case that cancel culture clearly isn't out of control. It does not have the power to take anyone out, and very wealthy and very powerful men clearly are not threatened by it unless they're serial sex predators. I doubt that's what he'll take away from this, though. Mark it down. I predict that he'll end up talking about cancel culture as if he personally defeated it with a punch in the jaw, rather than slowing down and noticing that he just proved cancel culture is not nearly as dangerous as it's made out to be if you're a cis male multimillionaire.